Well, Anne McArthur, welcome back. Welcome, Anne. We're so excited to have you on the podcast. And we're so happy that this book is finally out. It's beautiful and it's been fun to see it in real life. So thanks for doing it. And we really want to dive in and hear a lot of these stories, but also hear why this project came to be in the first place. So I don't know who wants to start, but tell us how this book came to be and why it matters.
So I think with any project I tackle, it's always kind of a dovetail of different pieces coming together that then all of a sudden spark like this needs to be, right? This needs to be something.
Yes.
Because these take time and effort, right? And so if it's going to come into be, you better have a really good motivation, right? Like not just be like, let's do a book. Like that's not enough of a motivation. And in this particular one, there was this confluence that I actually think is worth telling kind of all three parts.
Please,
briefly. But one was we were doing a book event for an activity day for Cherish for Heavenly Mother for one of our books. And a little girl in the room raised her hand and said, wouldn't it be great to do a book about women who ask questions? I'm like, that's a great question. And I'm going to steal your idea. Right. And so the dedication is actually to Ashley, who asks questions. Right. And like made that happen. So that was kind of one part of it. The other is I was sitting in a meeting, a professional setting with some church affiliated folk. And someone said to me in that meeting, McArthur, the brethren don't need yours or anyone else's ideas. And it was a Zoom meeting. So when I guffawed, like you could really see like all the way down my throat because it was like right in the screen, like, ha! Right? I mean, it was big in that moment. And I paused and I'm not a historian, but off the top of my head, I could name several ways that the church had been deeply impacted by ideas that came from people outside the brethren, which doesn't at all denigrate the brethren's role or their stewardship. You know, the ideas came in and then the brethren adopted them. But at the end of the day, like not all ideas came from that place. Mm-hmm. And I thought this is really interesting. If a lot of people are walking around with the idea that a revelation goes straight to the prophet and straight to the brethren and all things come to be in that way, then we're actually really doing ourselves a disservice for our own participation in our faith. And so I thought, well, that's an idea that needs to be scrapped. Right? Thank you. I was looking for like hogwash eradicators, one of my nicknames, right? That is some hogwash that needs to go, right? So that was an important idea. And then this kind of third confluence was that women seem to be at this crossroads of trying to figure out whether or not this is their church and whether or not their voices matter. And we had the idea for the book before the church social media and Sister Dennis and all that kind of situation. But even just 2 days ago in the Salt Lake Tribune, okay, this won't air 2 days ago, but in the last month in the Salt Lake Tribune, they talked about for the first time that there's more men than women in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in the U.S. And that is a dramatic shift for the first time in our history. And I thought if I were paying attention, I would want to know what was going on. And I think women speaking about whether or not they matter is a big part of this, if they feel like this can be their church. And frankly, I honestly have a positive answer. I have a 100% like encouraging answer. And so this book exists because it's kind of this confluence of all these ideas and understanding that the stories that we chose to focus on in Changemakers can really give hope and can really pave a healthy path for how we function as an individual and how we function as an institution. So it was kind of all of these things that made me call Anne and say, hey, I got an idea. Right.
Yeah. And how about you, Anne? What inspired you to get involved?
Well,
other than McArthur.
Yeah, I learned that when McArthur asks, you say yes.
Love that.
I mean, I've been passionate about women's issues and elevating women's voices for a long time. And it's kind of been a personal journey that I've been on to learn about my own voice and find my voice and find what I'm passionate about. And so through my work with Meetinghouse Mosaic, I had been studying women and people from around the world, learning their stories and learning the different cool things that they had been doing as pioneers in their own countries. And so that kind of worked right in with what McArthur was wanting to do, was to bring this global history of our church into a beautiful book.
Yeah.
So we have to tell you this great full circle moment along those ideas. So Anne was the researcher, and I'd seen that she does beautiful writing and that she was pulling out these people. And I was like, okay, we need to have a conversation. But all of us here loved Melissa anyway, still do.
Mm-hmm.
And she's actually the last woman we have in our book. But what's also this beautiful full circle moment is the reason those stories existed in the church's archives is because Melissa said, you know what? I'm looking through these global archives and we don't really have stories about women here. We have a lot of stories about bishops and stake presidents and missionaries who are male, who served in all over the world. But, there are women who are on the ground doing these things too. So one of the women on the cover is the first Relief Society president in Taiwan. And the reason she's holding a brick in her hand is because she built the church, literally, like gumboots through the mud, laying the walls of this building, right? And so because of Melissa noticing that women's stories were not present, the church started collecting those stories. Hence, we had a database of stories to pull from in order to create a book, right? That then we feature Melissa in. But it's this like beautiful moment of like change happens when everyone's throwing their bit into it, right? And putting things into the circle, and then different people can pick up different pieces and create in new ways. And so I think it's really beautiful how that came to be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you.
I want to talk about, well, I know we're going to spend a lot of time on the stories and the really amazing women in this book. But it would be very interesting for me to start out with this sort of foundation that you talked about, McArthur, that change doesn't always come from top down ideas. And I think like you can read this book, and it's a short book. It's like oriented toward children. You can read it in 20 minutes.
Yep.
And sort of come away being like, of course, that's not how it works. Like, here are all these amazing examples that you found and documented. It sounds like with Melissa's help, which is amazing. And yet, I think the actually more prevalent idea in the church is that that's not how change works. Like, I think we do think of revelation as this very top-down thing where, the prophet or some kind of top leader in the church will pray and get sort of like this direct, like, this is what needs to happen, and then it happens. So I'm curious, do you have an idea on where that sort of like cultural assumption came from when clearly that's not what the historical evidence points to?
The Old Testament prophets have all sorts of cataloged weaknesses and failures and humanity on display, right? I think Richard Bushman's book with Joseph Smith was fascinating, right? Because Richard Bushman comes at it from the standpoint of, this is a human being, right? And here's some of the detailed ways that he made mistakes. And yet we also believe he is a prophet, and that it's not an either or sort of question, right?
Yeah.
But I think that there was a period of time, specifically in American history, where it was not comfortable to have those things be in your head at the same time, right? That there was this very high level of eradicating cognitive dissonance and making sure that we're almost this like purest form of all things institutional are beloved, right? And then we see actually in American history that this starts to fall apart, right? That the people's trust now in institutions are at the lowest it's ever been. If the institution is the government or a corporation or a church, right? And so we've had this transition in our broader world about understanding that there's human frailty at all levels, that all systems are made of humans. So there's inherent frailty in that. But it hasn't seemed to totally, for everyone at least, translate to how we see things in our faith.
Yeah.
And I think that in some ways we've done a real disservice in not following that trajectory, because if we think that no one makes a mistake, because there's a trickle down effect, right? It's not just the prophet, but it's trickling down that like then the area of authority and then the stake president and then the bishop, right? And if you believe that, then when you bump against some very easily realized things, right? If you read the saints' books, that the church has put out about our history, if you go to a meeting and you see your bishop being tired, right? Yeah. Like you can very easily bump into the humanity of our faith. And then it's a very hard rock. I think that is a disservice, right? Where versus if we taught our children that we're all just doing our best, right? That we are human, but to have grace. It gives an opportunity for us for ourselves to live in grace and to teach our children to view the world with grace. And I think that grace gives us a soft heart. And having a soft heart about all of our humanity, including our faiths, right, is really important. Because if you get hard-hearted and cankered in your soul, then you might be really justified in your opinions, but you've become a being that's less holy.
Yeah.
Right. And so I think in acknowledging the humanity, one, we leave room for God, right? That God actually directs things and that God accommodates our weaknesses and our frailties. And that means that we can, in the likeness of God, accommodate one another with kindness as much as possible. Right. And so I think that there's a lot of healthiness in living in grace.
Yeah, I love that.
I think it's interesting. We have the famous phrase from Joseph Smith of teach them correct principles and let them govern themselves. And I think for a while, the church was kind of following that, and people had a lot more autonomy to do things within the church. And it was so new that, things were still getting figured out. But then I think we got to a point where everything was really prescriptive, and we had the Strength of Youth pamphlet and things that were like, when I was growing up, at least, that was like, you do these things and you get these results, and, and that's how you live a righteous life. Yeah. And so I think that we got to this really, I think it's human nature to kind of want to control outcomes and control how things go. And so we did get into a place in the church that felt very prescribed. But I think with President Nelson, we're kind of getting away from that. He's doing more of the family-centered, Christ-centered, church-supported stuff. And we're being given a little more leeway to figure out how to live the gospel, what it means to keep the Sabbath day holy, and, what it means to fast, or, whatever. And we're able to make those decisions a little more. But that is something new that I'm trying to figure out. How do I deal with what I learned as a child and that path that I had to be on, versus now having a little more freedom to kind of figure it out.
Yeah.
I wonder if there's something there about the global side of it too, because part of the alignment came in a period of time where they were trying to standardize globally. So there's kind of this crush to get things lined up. And then by the same pattern, we also realized globally that things don't always work in the same ways that we understand them to work. So the church, for example, that I attended in India didn't always have electricity. Right. And so if you were prescribing that we had to use the little electric piano to play the hymns, we could not rely on that. In fact, and we didn't have a regular piano. Right. And so there's global concessions that don't work. Yeah. Right. Or the changes in the garments we've seen recently. Right. Where they're the sleeveless kind of tank top dress that works really well for women, for example, in Africa, where the church is booming. But that is not something that was perceived as a need otherwise. And so I think both the global had first made us react to squish it together, and then made us now hold on, we actually need to go back to the principle of correct principles, let them govern themselves. Yeah. And actually, this is a really important idea overall in our book, because if we are to become gods and goddesses, which is something I firmly believe in the model of our heavenly parents, that means we have to learn to be sovereign beings. And sovereign beings have to be people who exercise their agency. We're not on Lucifer's plan to just check. We're going to make sure we do all these things. Literally, we have to become rock star agency professionals, right? And so that means we have to practice and fail, right? How we're going to go about living our lives. And as a parent, obviously you hope the failures are smaller and less damaging and, right? You try to keep them off the really big cliffs, right? But at the end of the day, our heavenly parents have to let us have agency. That was the entire point of this existence, to learn and grow and become. And I think that sort of model of agency is something that we as a faith are just kind of feeling our way back into. Yeah. And that there's a learning curve, as Anne was talking about, and how you grow up. But it's also the entire point of Earth life. Yeah. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So I want you to, we'll get into the stories, but I want you to address if someone's thinking but these are all of these examples, these are anomalies. These are big events that, primary was created by, because this woman had a good idea and she felt inspired, and personal progress. And what do you say to someone who's those are examples that are outside of the norm? Do you think that church leadership would agree that this is how change is made?
So first of all, it's not an either or, right? 100% revelation comes directly to the prophet, and then the prophet calls in the brethren and says, God has spoken to me. And let's not undercut how magnificent that is, right? I once heard Nyland McBain say, you know what, if we only get revelation 5% of the time, at least we're trying. Yeah. And I thought that was marvelous, right? Because all of us have worked in different organizations and businesses, and they're not all run by seeking to know God's will, right? So just to start with the baseline of like, let's celebrate the fact that we come from an organization that seeks to know God's will, and that it's not an either or, that there are 100%, of course, times that it happens that way. And it's not just in the anomalies as far as getting in ideas and getting in information. Yeah. And so, for example, the church hires pulling companies. They do focus groups. I was called in when I was living in India to speak about what the church experience like was for women in India, not just Indian women, but also women living abroad. And then when I went on my book tours, and I'd be talking to lots of different women about things going on. So we did like a 4-month tour across America for some of our first books. And it wasn't a 4-month tour, sorry. It took us about a month, but my kid was 4 months old. That's why I remember like burned in my brain that there was like, whew, that was intense, right? Along all of those stops along the book tour of the Girls Who Choose God, lots and lots of women told me about their situations and told me about their concerns and told me about things that were not right. So like, for example, one of the women was a nurse in an emergency room setting for the military. She was 47 years old. And she said, I'm not married to a member and I want to go through the temple and take out my endowments. And I've been told that I have to have written permission from my husband. And she said, I am an emergency room nurse, like the head of the floor. I make life and death decisions for 200 people on a daily basis. And I can't decide whether or not this is what is a good choice for me and my family. So these are the sorts of stories that I would hear, right? That women were running and bumping into these things. Or a woman who had an abusive husband who told her, you can date someone else in this life, but I get you in the next life. She's like, I'd really like to get my sealing canceled, but apparently I can't do that without him agreeing, right? So women are telling me these frankly horrific things. And these are not anomalies, right? I mean, these are women who are every single stop are coming up and telling me some variety of some story of how they're bumping into church policy that hurt, right? And so because I'd gone and I'd spoken to this women's committee, then this committee has been rolled into the family and priesthood committee now, but this women's group was collecting all of these pieces of information. So I'd email them and say, I've heard this one, I've heard this one, I've heard this one. And what's actually really, really beautiful is lots of those have changed. So I've tracked the emails that I sent and the policies that have changed. And just in the course of like a few years, really, almost all of those have shifted. Wow. And so this came because the church thought it was smart to set up a committee of people to have ideas about women and women's situation, right? And those people were interested enough and curious enough and humble enough to say, let's reach out and talk to people and learn what this is. And they told me they had a list actually of hundreds of suggestions and ideas and qualms that they were working on. And so let's be really clear, like 100% revelation comes down, and the church itself as an institution reaches out to try to pull information in. President Nelson says, good information inspires good inspiration. Right. And so I think that we have capital R revelation, direct light knowledge from heaven, which comes, and we have little pieces of revelation that get rolled in by the church's very proactive reaching out. Yeah. And then some instances we have from our women where the women were like, I got an idea. And it was not something that they had discovered in a focus group, but they independently had a great idea. And then the church recognized the women's wisdom of this idea and rolled it in, right? So
I have an experience of this kind of grassroots effort. So I did a training in 2020 that was focused on inclusion and helping women of color feel more included at church. And from that, we were split into we could pick these passion projects. And so I picked this passion art project to talk about art in the church, how we could make it more representational. And this group, there were probably, 30 or 40 of us in the group. And as we were talking, we were like, well, we should start an Instagram account and start talking about art and how Christ is portrayed as a Norwegian redhead in a lot of pictures. And, he historically is a Jewish man, and that's not accurate. And out of that was born Meetinghouse Mosaic. And so
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, and we haven't changed all the pictures. We still have the same pictures that we grew up with, but a conversation has started, and we're starting to see that needle moving a little bit. And so this is different than a committee that the church formed and said, let's talk about this. And they're doing their own work, and that's great. But we saw a need, and we started to educate ourselves and educate others about that. And there has been a shift kind of in the culture. People are at least aware of it now.
Wow. We heard from somebody just last week about a huge, like they just transferred over several paintings in all of the meeting houses just in Utah County, which I'm sure is part of the ripple. Yeah. That's amazing.
And I think that's something we should also emphasize. Like there's the church, that's the institution and headquarters and people who work for the church. Yeah. And then there's all of us who are the body of church. And I love that Jody Moore is always like, this is my church. Like I make up the church. Yeah. And so if there's something that we want to see done differently in the world, in our community, in our family, in our church, we can do this. Yeah. Like I actually love Reese Witherspoon says that one of the ways that she evaluates a movie script is if there's a scene and if the woman turns to the man and says, I don't know, what should we do? She's like, I axe the movie because I've never met a woman who doesn't have an idea, right? Like there are ideas out there. There are things we all care about. And if there's something we care about, we can do something about this. We can impact the culture. We can guide what's happening in our own communities and congregations. And I just think that's really exciting, right? It's really exciting that there's so many resources and there's so much connectivity that's possible. Like I love Instagram for the reason that, for example, I had to round up 50 artists to be in our Girls and Boys Guides to Heavenly Mother. I was able to find these artists through the church's international show. They posted lots of the artists, but then Instagram is how I found them. Wow. But like you can connect to people who are like-minded in any number of ways all over the world, and you can do things. Mm-hmm. And no one has to give you permission to do things, right? And then that will impact the body of Christ. Yeah. And honestly, hopefully the broader world. Like we have such rich opportunity. And I think that's something absolutely worth celebrating, that we have incredible resources at our disposal. I mean, just in talking to all my perimenopausal friends, I'm saying perimenopause as often as possible these days, just to like normalize it exists, right? So, but these women are coming. I mean, so in the last maybe 6 months to a year, all of these women have walked up to me and said, I really love Heavenly Mother and she really matters to me. And I've had a personal experience with her and all my kids are now in school. Mm-hmm. I, for the first time in my life, have 3 to 4 hours where I might be able to do something. What is something I can do? Right. And so we have this group of women who has time on their hands, maybe for the first time in their life after raising families, and are really looking to use their skills to help build Zion in a myriad of ways, right? And I just think that's super exciting that if you are passionate about something, doesn't have to be Heavenly Mother, right? Like, I mean, I think everybody should be, but but like really anything someone is passionate about, you can find an avenue to put your shoulder to the wheel. Yeah. Right. And I think that's a beautiful idea.
I love that. I mean, what else could it mean to be anxiously engaged? Like we've been thinking a lot about that word, like being engaged. Yeah. And it just seems like it's something about using all your faculties, like using your gifts and your talents, your life situation, like whatever resources happen to be in your life at this moment. That to me is what it's asking us to do. Engage all of those gifts and use them for good. So I really appreciated the way you've reframe that, because I'm always like conscious of being out of line, and I just really appreciated that stepping up is actually what I have been commanded to do, and like, and I think it can be uncomfortable because there's some element of creativity and you're trying something that you might not nail it the first time, and I appreciated that can be a calling that is so fruitful, and it's okay to not have the answer 100%, but you're like, you're really using all your gifts to try. And I love all these examples, like good fruit comes from those experiments. Yeah.
I mean, President Nelson said to sisters, directly to women, speak up, speak out, contribute to your sphere of influence. Right. Yeah. And I think that we have to just be okay with being a little messy. Yeah. Right. And I mean, the first time I curated an art show, a friend of mine was like, what I like about you, McArthur, is you have no idea what you're doing and it doesn't stop you. Right. But like, just again, it's about living in grace, right? And so if you're living in grace with yourself, then you're willing to make mistakes. You're willing to do something foolish. You're willing to do something you're not quite sure what you're doing. I mean, the first time I wrote a children's book, I hadn't written a children's book before. First time you've baked and decorated a cake, you hadn't baked and decorated a cake before. There's always a first time, right? Yeah. And if we give ourselves grace and we give our community grace, then we can say, look around. There's probably something you care about, right? Like people always ask us, like, this is really great that these women were, you know, this gung ho, but like, where do I start? What do I do? How do I do this? And I think it's just a very quick, like, what do you care about? Right? What gives you joy? What sparks you? What makes you disgruntled? Right? That is very, very fair to say. So one of the examples in the book we actually chose on purpose was Emma, because disgruntlement was the fuel that motivated eventually the word of wisdom to come. And we have this idea that we can't feel disgruntlement or we can't feel, right? There's another one of those great sounds, right? And so having this idea that the nature of God is the nature of transformation, and God can transform disgruntlement into a beautiful book, or into a word of wisdom, or to whatever it needs to be. Yeah. And so I think not being concerned about what feeling we're feeling and just saying, can this feeling be transformed into good in the world? Wow. Right?
And I think if we are looking at it with what we want to see changed, if we're only focusing on the outcome, then we're not going to have as much success. We're not going to speak up as often if we think, well, if I say this, my bishop's not going to do anything about it, so I won't even speak up. In the book, The Power of Everyday Missionaries from Clayton Christensen, he talks about how to be a successful missionary is just by inviting, just talking to the person. And it's not whether they say yes or no, it's just if you invited them. And I think the same goes with change making. If we're only focused on the outcome, then nothing's going to happen. We're just going to be discouraged and say, well, it's not even worth it because I can't do anything in my position. But if we just continually and relentlessly speak up and voice our opinions or, you know, advocate for change, over time, things will start happening. And even if you're just influencing one woman in your Relief Society or a man in your elders quorum or whatever it is, or, you know, not the bishop, but you influence his wife, like whatever avenue you can, that's success. And you're going to change hearts and minds, but that is a long process. So you have to play the long game with change.
And I was with this gentleman last night who said he knew the first person in the military who wrote a letter to the church saying, we need to do garments differently. I'm in the military and here's what the problem is. And I heard the story and I went blink, blink, because I now know men in the military who it's absolutely no big deal. One gentleman I know has to have fire retardant material because he dismantles bombs. And he's like, yeah, I just send in my fatigues to the headquarters and they screen on what they need to and they send them back to me. And it's just no big deal. And I sat there with my jaw hanging open, feeling like this, oh, it's no big deal now because someone then made it a deal, right? And so someone there had to write that letter. And I don't know how long it took to like make that happen. But for me, it emphasized Anne's point about the long game, right? That like you have to start the game. It's not a matter about how long it takes. You just have to engage in the game, right? And I just thought, oh, that's super interesting that it was things that we take as a matter of fact had to come from somewhere.
Yeah. It seems like to me that there are maybe two sort of primary methods that somebody could start change in the church, in the church in particular. And that would be like, one is just like doing something and just like not needing that to move up the chain in any way.
That's how primary started.
Okay, that's what I was going to ask. And then I guess the other would be like advocating for some change that does need to be eventually like a policy sort of like from the top. Even if you are just part of that context in which a prophet or a church leader pulls an idea and then institutes it. Right. So I'm curious, I guess, in your research, when you were looking at this, did you see one of those take sort of the primary form?
No.
Yeah.
I was going to say.
Well, and I think there's not a certain way that it will work. You know, there's not one path that you have to follow for being a change maker. I think with the primary story, it's really interesting because what happened, so this was Aurelia Spencer Rogers. She was living in Farmington, Utah, or somewhere up there. And her bishop, so they had an issue in their town where these young boys were rowdy and hoodlums is what they were calling them.
You're missing the air quotes, but they were there.
Yes, they were there. And the bishop called all the mothers in and said, we need to do something about your boys. And the mom, Aurelia, said, why aren't the dads here? Where's the rest of the town? Like, this is a town problem. We need to figure this out as a town and as, as parents together. And so she started thinking, there should be some organization that helps these boys learn things and have somewhere to go and something to do. And what I love is that she then was, the church was small enough at the time. So she went to Eliza Snow, who was the Relief Society president, and told her about this. General
Relief Society president.
And Eliza was like, yes, this is it. So it was these women that that were talking to each other and, had this idea and formed this idea. And then Eliza took that to the prophet and said, we need to do something about this. And girls were added in almost as a second thought of, she said, yes, when we sing, we need all voices. We should add the girls. So that was kind of how the girls got added into primary, which is unfortunate. But
hey, we weren't being hoodlums. Like, let's just be clear. Like, hey,
we were doing the laundry and caring for kids as children. But yeah, so I think that there are different avenues for it. She used her power as a woman to talk to another woman. That's a strength. That's a power that we have. And then that woman was in a position and had stewardship to go and talk to somebody that could make an actual official organizational change. And not all of us have those connections. I don't know anybody personally in the general leadership of the church that I could connect with that could, move things up the line. But, I think we start movements, we start things that can kind of snowball into something bigger. And maybe, I think we often have this desire when we want to see a change, we think, okay, this needs to go to the top. I'm going to send a letter to the prophet. I'm going to send a letter to my area authority, whoever it is. I've done that where I said, we need to bring education about anti-racism into our stake. We have some problems. There's kids that are saying the N-word in our ward, whatever. So I wrote a letter to our stake president, and he was like, this isn't what we're going to do. So I went to the Stake Relief Society president, and she was like, nope, sorry, not going to do that. And so then I went to the bishop, and he finally was like, yeah, let's have a fireside. And so we were able to do something. Had the bishop said no, I would have done a fireside or a chat in my own home. We don't have to go to the top or even to a leader. We can start things in our own homes and change minds that way.
Yeah. So just to be really clear on the story about primary, so the first primary was just a ward thing, and they actually instituted it inside the ward.
Yeah, and it stayed in the ward. It kind of spread out to other neighboring wards for a couple of years, and then primary was made an official organization.
I love what you said, Anne, about the, making connections is a different kind of power. And I was thinking about this when in the Melissa Inouye chapter, and you talk about just like this bold love that she had and a humility and this it feels like she was always talking about Jesus. I could just like hear her voice and everything that you said about her in that chapter. And I wondered, it made me think about leadership and femininity and how I think probably I see leadership in a very masculine way. And I probably try to always fit that mold. So have you thought about that? Like, do you see them showing up differently in ways that are powerful?
Yeah, we definitely, as women, we don't need to pretend to be men, or, there are, I think that all personality traits and leadership styles are on a spectrum. And, just because some are more masculine or feminine doesn't mean that the other gender can't do those, And so I don't think that we need to pretend to be men or do things the way that men do. And the way that things aren't necessarily the best way to do them. And so as we as women step into this and bring our natural abilities and personalities and, characteristics that we have, it can only broaden the scope of things and help things be better, And so I think we shouldn't be ashamed or afraid of bringing who we authentically are into the conversation, because it can only help.
Yeah.
So there's lots of research that shows, especially when women are in business, that the businesses function better, that they're more profitable, that women on boards make a difference, that women have a more collaborative leadership style, right? That they're more often likely to involve a wider range of people at the table and be able to see things from different people's perspectives. And so if you start to kind of lay down, and again, like there's a spectrum, men and women share different abilities in different ways. But if you lay down some of the things that they're talking about that are like stereotypical in female leadership, it's actually a really impressive list, right? And so one of these is being able to see different perspectives. That seems to be a thing that women do more easily than men when they've tested it in kind of a variety of ways. Another is that they're more collaborative. They're more willing to reach out and say, what do you think about this? How do we do this? Can we work together? You know, so the primary idea came because she went to someone else and she went to someone else, right? And so you just begin to pull in power synergistically of other people. There's also a fascinating article I read recently about gossip. And how gossip actually used to be, the word was just meant like godparent is kind of the root of the word.
Really?
And then it moved to the meaning to be speaking. And then it moved to being women speaking in a derogatory way, like women gossip, right? And that exists, true. But there's also this really large power in sharing information, right? And so I read recently about a group of women at a college that made a list of dangerous men that they had had personal experience with that were violent or hurting people. And they circulated that list among their female friends. And like that communication, that power to network, that power to connect with another woman, that power to gossip, to share information, meant that other women were prevented from having that experience. I mean, it was a safety measure. And I thought, okay, this is incredible. If this is a superpower of women to naturally connect with one another and share information, what can we do to harness women sharing information with each other to create cultural change? Like, it's a really interesting idea, right? But it's one of those things that my mom always taught me that you can be a kind of woman who gossips about people or a kind of woman who gossips about ideas. Right. And so she really, in our household, encouraged that we're going to talk about ideas. And I love that. Right. But I think underscoring this idea that gossip is always a bad thing, you know, like the old seminary, like gossip, don't pass it on.
Yeah.
Like there is that kind of gossip, right? Like don't talk badly about people.
This is the Mormon ad you're talking about?
This is the Mormon ad. I got my kind of
ad. With tar.
It was like sludge or something, right?
Yeah.
It was, right. Right. And that's true, right? That exists. But there's also this real power in trading information in order to help one another, save one another. I mean, how many women have you been like, I got it at Costco, $5, right? And and all of a sudden, all the women are like, I got one of those, right? I mean, that's just trading information to save your family money, right? I mean, like there's so many benefits to the way that women naturally share information with one another. Yeah. And apparently this is a more feminine style of communication. Part of my master's degree was in gender communication because I find it utterly fascinating. But part of this gendered style of female communication is to share information more easily than what men naturally share information, right? And so that helps in business settings and organizational settings, in saving money for your family. Like, and so I love this idea of like, okay, women, who do you want to sit around with and share information with? Okay, now what can that group of women who all cares about this information do in your community? Can you set up a community watch? Can you handle litter in your neighborhood? I mean, like there's ways that as women share information together that you can do good, right? And that's really exciting.
Okay, let me ask you this, because I know you are passionate about partnership and this integration of masculine and feminine. And I know that this is something you care so much about. Why? I guess what I'm thinking is, you know, in a patriarchal system like our church, that men who are not in charge are sort of in a similar position to the women. And so when you were thinking about the book and you're thinking about Changemakers, what is a man's role who's not in a leadership position? Like, did you find stories where men who were not in charge were doing the same kind of groundwork and coming up with good ideas and having maybe the same conflicts, like, you know, trying to have courage about their own gifts and good ideas and feeling like maybe it's not theirs to do because they're not called? Yeah.
So I want to address kind of two sides to that. Okay. And then Anne, I'm sure you also have thoughts, but one is, and this has changed, but in the 2015 and 2016 sharing time manuals, only 5 stories one year had a female protagonist. So it wasn't just in
1 year.
In 1 year, in 2015, there were 5 stories. In 2016, there were 6. So it means out of 52 weeks, 90% of the stories our children hearing are about boys. And that doesn't mean like Nephi and Abraham and things like that, but the protagonist the kid who's paying their tithing is also a boy, right? And so we choose to focus on women's stories because, and now we're not doing sharing time, so that's changed, right? But because the stories that are not being told are often women's stories, right? The voices we're hearing at General Conference, we had 2, 1 General Conference, and 3, the most recent General Conference, female speakers. And the men who speak are generally telling stories about men, not stories about women, right? And so we as a society have lots and lots of stories about men, which doesn't mean those stories aren't valuable. It just means they're not the only story that exists. It's not the only story taking place. And so we write stories about women. So your sons, Anne has 4 boys. Her sons, I have no boys. Her sons can learn about these women who are making change. So they recognize that women are participating in the world in this way. So we choose to emphasize the stories in that way. So that's why also yes, there are stories about men who are not leaders, who are doing things. But again, we're kind of supplementing what already is being told in our world, right?
Because we may be like socializing boys to do that more naturally, you think?
Yeah, absolutely, right? Because they're getting the story about the little boy who paid his tithing, right?
And they can immediately connect with that.
Yeah.
Little boys can.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. And there's so much that someone can do as an ally, regardless of what position they're in, right? And so I think that if we had the orientation that men and women working together is, 1, the divine model that we know from our heavenly parents, as stated in the Gospel Topics essay, but also just better. It's more productive. Systems function better when we do this way. And I think if we actually understood that orientation, then we would begin to shift how we go about things, right? And so I recently heard of a meeting that happened at church headquarters where a man walked in the room and they were going to talk about a certain topic, and he realized there was not a single woman in the room, and the topic was definitely impacting both men and women. And he said, I'll come back when there's a woman in the room, multiple women in the room. We can't solve problems if we don't have a variety of voices at the table, an expansive representation. And sometimes it's not just male and female voices, but it's socioeconomics, someone who experienced the world growing up with limited resources versus extended resources, sees the world differently, has different problems, has different understanding. And so I think it's about an expansiveness. It's partnership between men and women, but it's also an expansiveness of understanding that good ideas come when we can see the world from different perspectives.
Yeah.
Yeah. One of the stories that I found in research was from Brother and Sister Nugent in Jamaica. And they joined the church at the time when church meetings were on different days. And there were enough members that didn't live close to the church that this couple they had this big, huge van, and they would drive around to pick up all the different people every day, Sunday meetings. And then for primary, they'd go get all the kids, and then Relief Society, they'd get all the women. And it was taking forever. Their days were just full of driving around.
For gas.
Right. And so they were the ones that they wrote a letter, and they were like, hey, can we consolidate our church meetings onto one day? This would really be helpful. And so that's how that change came about. And so obviously men are making change, for the church, even men that don't have stewardship over that issue. Yeah. But I think that, if we look at this a little differently, one thing that I think men can really do who don't have an opportunity to make decisions for their ward or whatever is to listen to people that are speaking up about things and to kind of join their voices into the situation. I have a personal example that, when I was learning about Heavenly Mother and struggling with some ways that people were talking about her or not allowing people to talk about her, I was talking to my husband. This sort of puts him down for a second, but it comes back. So stick with me.
Roger's great. We love him.
He's amazing. So I was talking to him about this, and he just started to kind of mansplain it to me. And it's like, well, it's because blah, blah, blah. This is why this happens. And I kind of looked at him and I said, listen, this church is made for you to feel comfortable and to fit in well. And it's not necessarily made for me to fit in as naturally. And I need you to listen to what I'm saying and listen to the hurt that I have. And I need you to trust me that it's real. And he kind of sat there quietly for a few minutes. And then he turned to me and he said, okay, what do I need to do? Tell me all the podcasts, all the books, all the quotes. Tell me everything I need. I need to learn about Heavenly Mother so that I can understand you better. And so I made a list and I gave it to him. And he has been my best advocate and friend in this. And it has really helped us grow together. Obviously, as a couple, that's going to be, more personable and intimate change together. But any man in the ward can listen to women. I had a man in my ward, actually. He dresses up as Santa. He's got this big white beard. He's, in his 80s. He's this wonderful man. I said something about Heavenly Mother in a testimony one time, and his wife had just died, and he came up and told me about how he really needed his mother. And so I bought him McArthur's Boy's Guide to Heavenly Mother for an 80-year-old man and gave him the book, and he loved it. And he said, this is the best gift. And now he is one that will talk about Heavenly Mother. And so men that listen and, join their voices, I think that can be, that's the way that we need to have changes in this true partnership as men and women in the church.
Love that.
Yeah, thank you.
We all have a sphere, right? There's all a sphere where each of us has some kind of responsibility. Yeah. So if you're not a bishop, you're a primary teacher, or you're a greeter, or you're a Sunday school coordinator, right? So if you're in one of those other positions, you can say, I'm going to find quotes from female leadership. I'm going to make sure every time I teach a Sunday school lesson that I also make sure I quote a woman as well. I'm going to make sure when I talk to the young boys and girls in my classroom that I'm going to make sure that I tell stories that are both about little girls and little boys, right? I mean, there's any place you're in, you can help lift. We believe in change. Like as our foundational theology, we believe in change. I heard of a woman recently who said, I've never felt any pain at church as a woman. Okay, that's fine. But your lack of pain does not mean someone else's experience isn't also valid. So if you have not experienced pain, I invite you in this moment to go to talk to someone who has, right? Go find that person. Because if there's a pain point, there's a need for change. And again, you personally may not have experienced this, but you probably know someone who has.
Say more about if there's pain, then we need change. Because I think probably some people will be like, no. That's how we accidentally start creating God in our own image. Like we create a church that's just about comfort.
So I don't think of pain points driving us towards comfort. I think pain is a siren call for development and growth. Whether or not that siren call is to a person as an individual experiencing pain, or whether it's for an institution. So cognitive dissonance, when something's not making sense in your mind, is just like the first step on the path to being a sovereign being, right? That discomfort is motivating you towards growth, right? So as a church, if you do not think there's pain, then I think you need to go interview some people different than you, right? And as an organization, my professional career is in branding and marketing. We talk about what's our customer's pain point. If you're designing a new software model, if you're launching something, you're trying to solve a pain point, right? You're trying to create something to solve a problem, right? Yeah. And so it's not, a pain point is not an indictment of, you're not slamming the church. You're not putting the church down to say there's pain points. It's the human experience. Let's just acknowledge that pain is part of the human experience. And so when someone gets defensive about, I don't feel pain in the church, there's no problem here. It's not a commentary on something being wrong with the church. It's a commentary that we are all evolving and growing beings, and that the church is an evolving and growing institution as well. Of course it is. Yeah. Right?
There's a scripture in the Book of Mormon, and I can't remember where, but it talks about how these people were given everything that they wanted and that they needed. And I think that's important, that, pain is one way, disgruntlement is one way to change, to have change, but also people need things to improve. Sometimes we just need something to work or function a little better. And so, we can look at all of the processes that we have in the church and we can say, is this working in the best way possible to be the most uplifting, the most comprehensive, for everybody to thrive? Or is this maybe focusing on one person or one type of person or something? And so I think it's valid for all of us to look at the way the church is, and not in a negative way of like, I'm going to tear it all down, burn it down and start over. Even Jesus Christ he had that ability to recognize the needs of somebody. Somebody needed the woman who touched his hem. He easily could have brushed off and said, that's not how we do things. You make an appointment with the disciple and, whatever. He could have done that, but he saw the need that this woman needed to connect with him, and he turned around and saw her. And so I think that focusing on improvements that could be made just because we're not functioning at our best.
And think about all the changes with garments, right? Like, because climates are different, right? I lived in India where it was over 100 degrees for 6 months, right? Where we didn't have electricity on a daily basis. It means you don't have air conditioning, right? On a regular basis, on a consistent, reliable basis. You have different body types. You have different infections that come. You have, some people are pregnant, some people are nursing, some people are menstruating. I mean, like, you have all sorts of variety of needs to be managed in this. And so this has been a good one for you, Tim. And so, like, understanding that, like, as we get smarter and as we get kinder and as we get more global and as we get wider, like, there's challenges to solve, but we're up for the challenge. We pull together a lot of resources. The men and women in our church are good thinkers. So my husband is not of our faith, as we've talked about in the past. And he's always just like, okay, I'm just telling you, how do you people like get this made this way, right? Like, he attended a ward event with us. And at the end of the event, there's no announcement made, but it's just the evening's beginning to wrap up. So everyone just kind of stands up and starts putting away their chair, and someone pulls out the little dolly for the tables. And he's like, no, wait, oh, no one told anyone to do anything. Like, how did you guys just know to do this?
Clean up your own party. Yeah.
Right? And I flipped around and I thought, oh, that's really funny. Like, anyone who is raised Mormon understands how to pick up your chair and put it away, right? Like, it is just how it's done. It's like, just pause for a second and be like, we as Latter-day Saints have been trained with some seriously significant superpowers. One of them is to look around and assess what needs to be done and immediately pitch in. I think that we are well equipped to face the challenges that are going to face our church, right? Our most basic covenant that we join this community is to say, well, we mourn with those who mourn, comfort those in standing of comfort. So if you sit in my Relief Society and you hear the things the women are struggling with, like on a regular daily basis, there's struggle. I mean, we can call some word other than pain, right? Pain, struggle, discomfort, angst, like heartache, right? Like, right. Any of those, right? Yeah. But what I'm saying is that's naturally part of our world. We have a choice to make. We can be a friend to those in pain, or we can ignore their pain. Mm-hmm. One of my incredible sister friends sees the world nothing the way I do. I mean, you could not get people farther apart on a spectrum of like worldviews, right? Like lay it down, like politically, emotionally, she's way disciplined, et cetera, right? I mean, like all the ways. And she is a Relief Society president. And she called me up recently and she said, I realize I don't feel pain at church, but I don't want to be complicit in the situation. I'm going to go find out. I'm going to go ask. I think it behooves us to consider our baptismal covenant, to say who around me might be bumping into pain from A, B, C, D, whether or not it's a job loss, whether or not it's heartache with a child, whether or not it is experiences at church, whatever way that someone's living that, like we literally have covenanted to care about one another. There's pain. Yeah. So if you're sitting there listening to this and you're thinking, I don't experience pain like this, well, then you have a covenant responsibility to look around and figure out who is experiencing pain right now and what is appropriate and necessary and good for you to step in to do this.
One of my favorite quotes from President Holland says that the purpose of Christianity is to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. And I think that we are given opportunities or chances in our life that do make us extremely uncomfortable or fill us with pain. And the important thing is what you do with that pain.
Yeah.
This is our opportunity for growth, which we've talked about here. Mm-hmm. And I think that it's the way that we become like our heavenly parents.
Yeah.
I know we have to, but like, I really love the story of Ardith Cap. Would you share the story before we close?
We love this story for any number of reasons. So when we were reading through all these research and stories and trying to figure out who we wanted to include, we intentionally wanted a wide range. We wanted some who had institutional access in a way that most of us don't. We wanted some that were, I have never laid a brick wall for a church building in my life, but apparently in Taiwan, you do.
You do that.
Right? And so like understanding that people have a range of life experience, people have a range of access to resources, people have in and out of institution. Like we wanted a range of what change making felt like. And all of them have to do with the church and church adjacent and change in our culture and sometimes structure, but a wide range of experience here. And so in some ways we're hesitant to include Ardith because most of us will never be the General Young Women's president, right? Yeah. But there's some very indicative things about her story that I think are vital for every person in our church and especially for women. So the reason I love this story, and we'll tell it briefly, but you probably should get the book and read about it. And then you should read Ardith's biography because it's so good, right? All the things. She woke up one night and felt inspiration just flow through her, like compelled her out of bed. And she got to her desk and she started writing down. And she talked about how the Spirit just like literally felt like the Spirit was directing her hand to like handwrite this out. And in her next meeting with the 70 that she reported to, she says, "Oh my gosh, does this happen? This is experience, yada, yada." And he says, "No." And then she brings it up the next month. And the next month. And apparently she brought this up multiple times to the point where he said, "We're not going to do that. Quit bringing it up." He probably said it nicer than that, but that's what he said, right? And in that moment, Ardith had a choice to make, right? I have been told by the person I'm reporting into, by the hierarchy, by my leader, that this is not what's going to happen. Against, I have had this personal revelation from God that I'm very clear is from God. So who am I? Where's my nexus? Where's my epicenter of trust? Is my epicenter in the trust in the arm of the flesh? Or is my epicenter in trusting God? Ardith waits a couple months, has another meeting, this time with Thomas S. Monson. And he's like, "Anything else in your mind, Ardith? Anything else you'd like to discuss?" She said, "Yes, there is." And she slid across his desk in a folder this pamphlet that she'd written, which became the revised version of The Strength of the Youth. She got rid of the curlers and "you're not supposed to chew gum." No curlers in public or chewing gum. We're in one of the early versions of The Strength of the Youth, right? And so I think about this story, and we interviewed Ardith just maybe a month or two before she died. And so powerful to hear of a woman who trusted God that overwhelmingly. Like the trust was so significant that anything else paled in comparison to what she knew. So she slides that across his desk, and Elder Monson at that time said, "Oh," and 6 months later it got into print. She knew God had spoken to her, right? And she didn't give up.
Yeah.
And so regardless of whether or not we're all going to be gender young women's presidents, I think having that understanding that God can speak to us, does speak to us, and that we can rest in that assurance.
Yeah.
And then we can take that assurance into whatever place, meeting, format, moment that we need to hold on to. Yeah. So for me, it's a challenge, especially to women, to say, do you trust in God? We need to develop such a relationship that we can hold to that no matter what comes at us.
Yeah. I think the cool thing about our book is at the end of each woman's story, we have a little page that says, "God asks us to build Zion. We can be a change maker like whoever the woman is. And then it says all you have to do is lead or organize or whatever it is. And so we wanted to share these stories, but we wanted to kind of leave each one with like, how can you do this? What change are you going to do? Which one of these methods of change most speaks to you? And I think what's important about Ardith's story is that she was ready with her information, with her revelation, and she was waiting for the right time. She tried a few times and it didn't work, and she didn't just throw it away and say, okay, well, I was wrong. But she just was waiting. And so we find the things that we're passionate about, and then we say, okay, this is what I think, this is an idea I have, this is a way we could change how we do funerals in our ward, or something we could implement in primary, or, you know, whatever the thing is. And we wait for the time that it's needed and the right time for that to come out. But if we don't do the work first to find what we're passionate about, first of all, and then to, you know, process through that and work through what needs to happen and what's the best way. And you know, I think that maybe 100% of Ardith's things didn't come into fruition, but the idea was there, and she collaborated with her leaders to make it be the correct thing that needed to move forward at that time. Mm-hmm. And so if we have our passion and we have the way that we want to do it, and then we have the humility to think that somebody else can help us formulate this in a good way, then we can move forward when the time is right to be an instrument in God's hands.
I have to just say, we just interviewed Rich Hanks about his dad, Marion D. Hanks. And the thing that I, after that interview, just sat there thinking about was he was like a tidal wave of ideas. Mm-hmm. He just kept, the ideas were just flowing. And we were celebrating a lot of the things that had changed because of his ideas. But mm-hmm. there's quite a list of things that never happened. And I think that's just as valuable. Like what it showed me was just that he showed up. Like he showed up, he was so engaged with his whole brain, his whole heart, all of his own inspiration and gifts. He was just constantly, it was this output of like, maybe we could try this. Maybe we could try this. And sometimes it totally caught on and we still feel the ripples. And a lot of times it was just like, yeah, you know, maybe it was a good thought, but it's not going to happen. And that was okay. Like it didn't mean that he was that something went wrong. It was just like, I think that's what happens when ideas and inspiration are flowing. Like some are going to work and some aren't. And maybe part of this project is having the humility to just to not feel like you know exactly how things should go, but also I think humility is the thing that makes you capable of taking that risk and just like being creative when it might get shot down and moving on, and that's okay, and just like keeping them flowing. My husband and I like to, when we have conversations with each other about different ideas or concepts, we'll be like, is this a thing? Like, is this something that could turn into something, you know? And so coming up with ideas, and I love that, of having this just flow of innovation and like not shutting ourselves off to the Spirit, but being open to constantly get ideas. McArthur's great at getting ideas and being the idea and the hype person behind the idea and all of that, like, and making adjustments and like pivoting and doing it how it works best and going through the best, you know, whatever publisher or whatever it is that will have the best impact. And I think that we need to be open to following that guidance from our heavenly parents, because I do think that they are, you know, it's not the chessboard like we've often heard about, but I think that they are inspiring us to do things that will make improvements in the whole world, not just in the church. Yeah.
There's an Old Testament story I love where the prophet tells the people who are living in a drought that they need to plant. And some people are like, no, you're crazy. Right? Our seed, like that, they'll be completely not productive, right? And some people say, all right, I'll go plant. And then when the rains unexpectedly came, the people who had planted bore fruit, right? So we're not responsible for when the rains come. That's a divine decree. Our responsibility is to plant. So we can plant and plant and plant and plant and plant and plant in all the myriad of ways our talents and abilities and reach can do in the world. We can plant all the goodness in the world we can do, and some will bear fruit and some won't, but that's okay, right? It's my job to plant. It's divine's when the rains come.
I love that.
I think that's a beautiful place to wrap up. Thank you both
Thanks.
so much for the book. It's so beautiful. People can find it at Desert Book, it sounds like.
Yeah.
Yep.
So
Yep.
I
And
hope-
online and at the Compass Gallery. And if your bookstore doesn't carry it, go ask them to.
Yeah, that always helps.
All right, thanks so much for listening. We really hope that you enjoyed this conversation with McArthur and Anne. You can find their book, Changemakers, on Amazon and at Desert Book. And we would love to hear from you. Please send us your experiences, your stories, your thoughts at info@faithmatters.org. Thanks again for listening.